Hi, everyone. So before we start this session today, and we are entering our fourth session, I will again explain how it works and how we proceed. We will first have Robin's presentation, and then after her presentation, we have a session and time for a Q&A. I would like to remind you that we are having Robin today, as our last series was about eradication in general, and Patti Bayo and Annie Little came to talk about eradication of mouse and cats and other species on islands. And we heard you were really interested to hear more about deer eradication and if we had other examples. So Robin is here today to talk about her experience with deer eradication in Gwaii Haanas. This project has nothing to do with Sidney Island, and Robin has no real engagement in the Sidney Island project. So please remind that if you ask her question about the Sidney Island project per se, she will not be able to respond. Yet Stephanie is here and other people are here. So these are the people you should be connecting with. If you have specific question, maybe you can put it in the chat, and Stephanie can collect them with all the other questions we are collecting about the Sidney Island project. That said, I would like now to introduce to you Robin. Robin Irvine, which I killed the last name, sorry, straight away, is an ecologist with Parks Canada and has worked with the ecosystem conservation team since a while. Previously, she was a conservation and restoration manager for Gwaii Haanas. She has a PhD in statistical ecology and 20 years of experience in applied ecology in Western Canada. She's presenting today from the unceded territory of the Haida Nation, and she wants to share with us the lesson learned from her engagement in the Restoring Balance project. It had a real nice First Nation name, but I really don't want to kill that too. So I will just call it Restoring Balance. The project entailed eradicating Sitka deer, which is an invasive species from Gwaii Haanas National Park Reserve, National Marine Conservation Area Reserve, and Haida Heritage Site. So welcome, Robin. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And please tell us more. We are really keen to hear your story.
Thank you for the introductions, Stephanie and Bea. Stephanie's going to be sharing her screen today, since I am, as you can probably see, giving you this talk from my car, from the unceded Haida territory on which I live in the winters. Internet is a bit of a scarce resource here in some places, so here I am. I first off want to acknowledge all of my co-authors on this talk. This project was not done in isolation, and there are many people who aren't on this slide who are also integral to this project. What I'm going to talk about today, as Bea mentioned very clearly, is really particular to a site. I'm going to talk about how parts of this approach worked, how parts of it didn't work, the lessons learned, and the unique setting is really critical to each of these eradication projects that you're learning about through this speaker series. I'll try and give lots of opportunities for questions at the end, so I will go through this at a relatively rapid clip, but I'm happy to talk about anything in more detail at the end. So the Restoring Balance project, or in settler framed Haida, Ogagwistitha, was an eradication of invasive Sitka black-tailed deer on 6 islands within Gwaii Haanas Reserve. And this project was developed in concert with international eradication experts and based on techniques shown to be effective in other parts of the world. Slide 2, please. So this project was motivated by what you can see in these 2 slides here. The slide on the right is on Ramsey Island, Haida Gwaii, which has had deer probably since about the 1940s. And the island on the left, which is Lost Island, has no deer because of its distance offshore. So there's this incredible loss of not only forest diversity in the coastal forest ecosystems in Gwaii Haanas, but also all of the attendant other ecologies that are based on that. So fantastic work done by Jean-Louis Martin and many of his research associates, as well as Council of the Haida Nation, have shown a loss of pollinators, a loss of insects, a loss of songbirds, and other groups on the island that are associated with this loss of forest diversity. So Gwaii Haanas is a park reserve and a Haida heritage site, and it's co-managed by the Haida Nation and the Government of Canada. So the management board, which is called the Archipelago Management Board, chooses how to focus their efforts on ecological integrity and restoration. And they've had a focus on invasive species management for many years in order to address some of these heavy impacts we're seeing in the slide here. So this project was started in 2014 to address the overbrowsing impacts of invasive Sitka black-tailed deer. Next slide, please. In addition to the ecological impacts, there's also a very significant cultural impact, and the two are intertwined and also can be considered separately. So the Haida people have a long history of living on these islands, at least 30,000 years, according to archaeological and oral history records. And cedar trees have been on Haida Gwaii for about 4,000 years and have been sustaining the Haida people for centuries for many cultural materials such as weaving, cedar bark hats, totem poles, canoes, paddles, longhouses. And every year, with the invasive species browsing down the natural heritage, it gets increasingly more difficult to find plants, not just cedar, but also important medicinal plants such as devil's club. So many of the restoration sites in this project did not have young cedar growing in the forest. It's walking around a forest that's missing all of the adolescent and all of the youth. There's just grandmother and grandfather trees. So in next slide, please. This is the project site. So Gwaii Haanas is a fairly remote archipelago, as I'm guessing most folks are aware. It's about 80 nautical miles from the mainland. It's about 5,000 square kilometers of land and sea. And this project took place in Juan Perez Sound within Gwaii Haanas over 6 islands. These islands were selected for a couple of reasons. One, because of their conservation value, and secondly, because of previous conservation work that had been done on them, removing invasive rats. So the main goals of this project, next slide please, were to eradicate invasive Sitka black-tailed deer from Ramsay Island, which you can see here in the bottom right of the slide. It's the large ones, about 1,600 hectares, and all the adjacent islands to allow improved biosecurity, the ability to intercept deer as they tried to get back to Ramsay Island. One of the next goals, pardon me, was to maintain low deer densities on southern Lyell. So that's at the top part of the slide. You can see Lyell, and the southern part is highlighted in green, to prevent reinvasion, and to restore forests either passively or actively to allow the growth of culturally significant plants. The other thing we were trying to do was, as a goal, was to increase and develop what Parks Canada calls visitor experience opportunities. So those are effectively anyone who's coming to the park who's wanting to understand more about the ecology, to learn about restoration and invasive species management. Next slide. So this might be old hat to you guys after the speaker series you've been involved in, but I just wanted to give a quick review of what an eradication is. It's the removal of every single invasive animal. It, by global standards, is the maintaining of the removal of all of those animals for a 2-year minimum to determine it's a success. And then the aspirational goal is, of course, to retain invasive free status in perpetuity. Most eradications follow a general arc with a knockdown method removing most of the animals, and then what's called a mop-up method to remove the wary and sparse remainder, and then grid searches to confirm zero. This is, of course, for larger animals that, like we're talking about today with deer. And eradications are a really well-proven conservation tool and ecological restoration method in many countries, and in Canada. And in Canada, the current list of eradications is relatively small and mostly focused on rodents. So we tried to really leverage the global knowledge on deer and ungulate eradications by using international experts as our contractors and pairing them with local staff and staff from other agencies to build local capacity. Next slide. So the plan for the eradication was relatively simple. It was a 3-phase operation in alignment with those phases I just spoke about. The knockdown method that was determined to be most likely to be effective and was also acceptable to the management board was bait station hunting. So a really critical part of this project that I'll talk about a little bit more throughout is that it was extremely important to the local community and Haida leadership on our co-management board that as much of the meat as possible was used from this eradication. So in New Zealand, many ungulate eradications start with a knockdown method of toxicants, but that was not a possibility for us. The second stage was to be aerial hunting once 70 to 90% of the animals were taken out by the bait station. And this was to be followed up by dog and ground hunting to finish the hunting and to work in concert with the helicopter to do grid searches to determine that we were at 0 animals. Next slide. So I'll just talk a little bit about each of these methods and how we kind of chose to get here. Bait station operations are really intensive to set up, more than I would have anticipated, because you're looking at what you've got here are 2 images. So there's me cutting branches in the bottom image to create clear sight lines for the sharpshooters who would be stationed at these bait stations, looking down a shooting lane to remove the animals without alerting or making wary any other animals. So it takes a lot of prep time. And then the other thing is there's quite a bit of social conditioning that has to happen with the animals. So they have to understand that there is reliably going to be bait at these places, or why would they bother putting it on their foraging route? And then once you give them sort of free flow, available 24 hours a day baiting, you then have to condition them to only come there at a time of day, so that you're not having to hunt each station for 24 hours a day. So in a remote setting like Gwaii Haanas, the baiting operations were extremely intensive. So because of those factors. So not only did we have to hike in prep the sites as you're seeing here, hike in all of the dry corn that we used as bait, but we had to ignore the tides and get to each of these stations at a particular time of day every day to rebait. Some of the sites had automatic bait feeders, which were helpful, but in the extremely rugged marine environment, it was definitely, some of them would plug up, so we would have to go check them. So this was a really logistically difficult and challenging setup. Just go back to the baiting there, Stephanie. The baiting simply did not have the effect we hoped it would have. I have some data later on where we can talk about it. But we're not exactly sure why. The suspicion of the bait technical lead, Dr. Tony DiNicola, pardon me, was that the draw to the bait wasn't necessarily strong enough. This project started, we started baiting in March and we started operations in April for actual shooting. And so the green up, as you know, living in a coastal environment as well down there, is quite early. I mean, it's happening now on Haida Gwaii as I look outside. So it may just have been there wasn't enough attraction. There was also some indication that the number of bait stations that we used was potentially inadequate. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So the next method, aerial hunting, been proven to be extremely effective on a variety of species. And this was planned, as I said, as the second phase. And the deer were supposed to be at this point at moderate to low densities. But just to give you a bit of a frame, Ramsay Island, that 1,600 hectare island that you saw in the map, probably had about 450 to 480 animals on it to start. And when the aerial operations started, there was probably about 350 animals remaining. So it was still a fairly dense population. The other thing that we had assumed, which was proven to be wrong quite quickly, was that the deer would be very naive to aerial work. So lots of deer, when they hear the helicopter for the first time, if they haven't experienced aerial work before, we'll just stop and look up for a second. But the deer, Sitka black-tailed deer, actually behaved, according to our aerial expert, more like goats. So what they would do is they would bolt and zigzag and then hide behind shrubs very, very, very quickly. So it gave them a very short amount of time to acquire the target. The second thing that was interesting, which we knew, but we weren't exactly sure how much of an impact it would be, but it interacted with that goatiness of the deer, was that the trees on Haida Gwaii are very big, which means you have to fly, they're very tall, which means you have to fly a little higher than you do in New Zealand and in other places. So you're actually dealing with a smaller target. So this aerial operation the plan was to reduce the density so that the dogs, when they arrived, could deal with the very low densities and just be kind of a cleanup operation. However, the queen bees interfered. So this is a strange logistic part of the story, which is effectively a lot of Canadian beekeepers, of which I am one proud beekeeper, we buy our bees from New Zealand because of the alternate seasons of the Southern Hemisphere. So queen bees, when they fly to Canada and North America, get the whole plane. So no other livestock or animals can be transported at the same time as the queen bees. So the queen bees actually forced us to bring the dogs over to BC earlier than we had planned. So we ended up with the dogs earlier, and also with the higher densities from the bait stations. So the dogs arrived and there was very high densities. Next slide, please. This is sort of an indication of, this is kind of all of the tracks of the aerial operations over Ramsay, and you can see House and Hot Spring Island in the top left. This is just kind of an indication of the coverage. The amazing thing with helicopters is you can get very fast, very far, very far, very fast, and see what you see and kill very quickly and humanely with a good operator, a lot of animals. And this island is not rugged by some standards, but it's moderate, I would say. There's some good elevation gain and loss. There's quite a bit of blowdown, as you see in a lot of coastal forests. And so some of the areas were very difficult to access on foot, but were incredibly accessible by air. The other thing that the aerial operations facilitated for us was drops of dog hunters. So if you look at this island, if you look at the sort of top, how can I put that? If you're at kind of 11 o'clock, there's sort of a green bay. If you were to hike from that water up into the center of the island, it would be about 45 minutes for an averagely fit human. And so what we were able to do with the helicopter was just pick little spots and clear a couple of trees, and the helicopter could just put down and drop a dog hunter so that they could work down from the top of the island very quickly. So it gives you a lot of access point as well. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So dog and ground operations. The dogs, we had two different types of dogs that we were utilizing. All of them were from New Zealand. There are very few professional hunters in Canada, and there's very few who have the history that the hunters in New Zealand have, just because of the deer culling, eradication, and work programs that have been in place in New Zealand since about the 1960s. The two types of dogs we had were indicator dogs and bailing dogs. And so indicator dogs are what you would picture when you think about like a bird dog for hunting, where the dog smells a trail, follows the trail, and then stops and points out the animal to his or her hunter. They are like incredible, and the way they were outfitted was, you can see on the left you've got this Astro 320. That was a Garmin product that was basically, we had the topographic maps, and then the dogs had collars, so you could actually see in real time where the dogs were going, and if the dog was separated from the owner, you could also see the pace of the dog. So when a dog comes across a deer track, their pace would increase because they would get excited and they'd be on the move. You can also see on the right-hand part of this slide the map of the coverage of the dog operations. And similarly, you know, these guys would go, I've just been working on a lot of the data from this operation in 2017, and these guys would go anywhere from 3 to 14 kilometers a day for days and days and days and days and days on end. They really cover ground, the hunters and the dogs. And I guess back to the bait station, I'm trying to do this kind of evaluatively so you guys can ask questions that are relative to what we learned. They brought dogs that were specifically trained and good with low densities of animals, because there are different types of dogs you have for high density versus low density. And that was based on the operational plan and also on what we thought we were seeing with the bait station hunting. But when they showed up, there was still relatively high density of animals. So effectively, we kind of had to do the eradication, as one of the New Zealand colleagues put it, you know, the old-fashioned slow way, just hunting and picking them off. Next slide. Okay, boat operations. So we live in a marine environment. Very common here for hunters to hunt deer from boats. And this was not part of the original plan at all. One of the take-home points for us was that it's very difficult in some of these planning stages for local experts to be heard by international experts. And what we really found throughout the project was that there was a lot of back and forth of information. And one of the biggest pieces was around boat hunting, because all of our local folks who were actually doing the hunting had done a lot of this and had a lot of expertise. And so what happened when the bait stations weren't working as expected, when we had that very severe fall off of numbers quite quickly, and we knew there were still lots of animals, was that we implemented boat operations. And we also implemented operations on a 24-hour cycle, as opposed to just during morning and dusk. So what this looks like is you're effectively circling the island either at night with a FLIR, which is a forward-looking infrared monocular, or a spotlight, and then getting dropped on shore to shoot the animal. And you're with or without a dog that can pursue the animal if there is an injury that needs to be ethically followed and killed. So yeah, so usage of this method, as you'll see shortly, was very effective and also very exhausting. Next slide. So two aspects of the program on Haida Gwaii met with both tons of community support and tons of community criticism, and that was the meat program and the use of local contractors and staff as much as possible. So we have this really interesting program on island. UBC runs it with the Haida Gwaii Higher Education Institute. They have a semester up here in non-COVID times where folks, university students come up and they study. And so they're able to ask questions that we at Parks Canada aren't. They did a really cool survey where they interviewed people in the fall after the major operations about how they felt about the meat program and the local food to schools program that we supported with meat from the program. So of the deer killed, we were able to use about 60% of the meat to either feed workers in camp, supplement the dog food in camp, support the Haida Gwaii watchmen in the field, and support nearby tour operators and sites, as well as bringing meat back to town. The perception in town was that only about 20% was used. And that was unfortunate because that wasn't actually true. What happened was the meat recovery program went very well, garnered significant support, but then the project kept going and people didn't know about the other aspects of the meat collection. So it was a very interesting lesson for our engagement folks and our external relations and communication folks. The other thing I do want to say here is that while the primary goals of the project were to eradicate deer and create better habitat for species at risk and improve the forest ecosystems, the secondary goals were to distribute as much venison as possible and educate the local communities about the effects of deer. And that did happen, but it was a little bit derailed, I would say, by the fact that some of the controversial aspects of the project didn't allow the communication to be as fulsome as could have been. Next slide. So this is what I've sort of tried to talk about throughout. So this was the actual plans. This is what happened. All of these projects are extremely adaptive, and the project team led by Chris Gill from Coastal Conservation and myself on the park side as project manager, with huge support from Greg Howell at Island Conservation, Carl, I'm blanking on his last name right now, Greg will have to tell me in the chat, Carl from Island Conservation and others from around the world, Keith Broom from New Zealand, really helped us to be adaptive throughout the course of this project. This project ran from March until October of 2017, and then we had follow-on work in the spring of 2018. Yeah, so I recently had the opportunity to talk to some of the professional hunters about their reflections, a few years on, about what could have improved our chances of completing the eradication. Because if I haven't said it already, this eradication was not complete. So many of the things they said reflected my learnings as well. One of the real take homes was, if you're going to have a phased approach, take significant breaks between the phases. But why significant? I mean a couple of weeks. I'm not talking like a year here, and have a method that's reliable, or you know the reliability of, for estimating the density, so that the next phase of methods can be tailored to the densities remaining. That was a really big challenge for lots of reasons I've already spoken to. One of the big things that we learned through this project and through work with Dr. Mike Russello and Brock Burgess at University of British Columbia, Okanagan, was that the DNA methods now are so good and so precise that you can go out and get a class list of every deer that's on the island, and then understand how you're doing at removing them through time. So we're working with them on developing those techniques within the region so that they can inform other eradications in the future. And then one of the other big lessons learned was having a data manager and analyst on site throughout the project would have helped a lot in tracking where we were at. We were always kind of making do. The helicopter engineer was incredibly helpful to us, Beth, and others really helped. And we did have data managers from parks, but they were in and out on shifts, and it made it very difficult. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is just a stacked histogram. So this is effectively just a count of deer killed on the y-axis and the time through the year of the 2017 operations on the x-axis. So you can see, this is super tiny on my screen, but the sort of brown color is the bait stations. So you can see that's how we started. And in an ideal world with our operational plan, that would make up about 70 to 90% of the barred area you're seeing here. And you can see it's more about, I think it came out around 23%. The green, which is the Kelly green, which is the boat, was the addition to the program. And you can see overall it was quite effective. And then you can see sort of the helicopter in the blue and the two types of dogs, as well as line push in purple, which is more of a technique we used in the fall. Next slide, please. These projects, as you know, are controversial and challenging for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. We had an amazing team led by Miranda Post in communications, who worked very hard to get information out to the media and to the community about what was going on. As much as we, the reason we're doing these things is to save the forests, that pales in comparison to the fact that you're killing a lot of animals. And so that's always what's going to come out. And it's really just thinking about, how best to talk about these sensitive topics. I'm not a psychopath or a sociopath. And so I care very deeply about all these animals dying too. And so it's conveying that the cost of that is worth it for the conservation gains. Next slide, please. So results. So as I said, this eradication is considered incomplete in the global database of island eradications. There was a choice made by our co-management board, the AMB, to stop operations after 2018 and to refocus efforts Haida Gwaii wide on invasive mammal management towards creating a vision that everyone could agree to, and that interagency and intergovernmental cooperation could be found and used as a way to go forward in these types of projects. What we have been seeing, though of course it's temporary unless additional deer management is done, is an incredible rebound of the vegetation. And so that's been very heartening to see, including some very rare and previously unseen plants on some of these islands, as well as a lot of cedar, a lot of baby cedar. The other result is that the confidence and capacity that was built within the Gwaii Haanas team and across Parks Canada Agency is certainly one of the lasting legacies of this project, where, you know, you don't know what you don't know. And then once you do one of these projects, you learn a lot, and you learn more and more and more, as others, I'm sure, in the audience could speak to more than I can. Next slide, please. So what I've tried to cover for you guys today, and I'm happy to talk about further in the Q&A, is we kind of learned what worked well and not well in this setting. I called this talk Gained in Translation because I felt like we really leveraged what we could from other projects in other countries, but we also then had to learn. You can only leverage so much, right? We're not living in the world of the Matrix where you could just download somebody's brain into yours, unfortunately. And it wouldn't necessarily be applicable. So at the end of our 2017 operations, we'd removed over 595 deer from the restoration islands. We had set up vegetation plots to track the recovery. We had done a DNA project that allows us to plan for future eradications. And in the recent year, in 2020, we were able to complete on a symposium to meet the needs of the AMB, the management board, to create a vision that the whole of Haida Gwaii can agree to and work towards across agencies. Next slide, please. Yeah, the back and forth exchange of local knowledge is super critical, and this was a particular thing for us, but it is in every project. It's a massive component, the logistics. So the image on the left is an image of Ramsey Island that was up in the float camp, which was our operations station. The entire east coast of this island, which we had to cover with bait stations, was uncharted. So none of the rocks were on our maps, on our charts for the boats, and it was incredibly difficult to do that. Next slide. And with that, I'll just say Haawa for your time and open the floor to questions via my lovely facilitators here.
So we have seen starting some question on the chat box, and it has been kind of, I would say, maybe answered, but they were asking a little bit more about the Sitka deer and how it is different from the black-tailed deer we have on the island, like on Sidney Island, but also on Vancouver Island. So we have had some answer, but please, Robin, if you can give more information about it, it would be amazing.
Yeah, so Haida Gwaii only had one native ungulate, which was caribou. And it was extirpated around the turn of the last century. So the Sitka black-tailed deer here are Odocoilus hemionus sitkensis, as the link that Greg's got there. They were imported for meat, and for a long time they were protected because they took a while to take off, and now they outnumber the humans about 150 to 1. So you probably wouldn't recognize them. They're tiny here. The first full-size doe I saw when I moved here in 2015, I thought was like a tiny fawn. They're just a really modified body type because of the availability of browse that has declined through time. So that's, I guess, the relevant information on top of what you've already got from Greg there.
Any other question, either in the chat box or okay, we are getting a question. It's what is known about how native deer population respond following the eradication of invasive species? So do you have any examples you can bring forward in your experience? You were saying some of the vegetation, but maybe others.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so relevant to Haida Gwaii, Virginia, because there was no native deer here. So I don't have any direct examples. Yeah, basically I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question though.
I think I saw Ben with his hands up and then he disappeared. So I don't know if that was Ben wanting to ask a question or not. I'll ask you to unmute, Ben, if you had a question. You are now unmuted.
Here.
I'm sorry, my internet is very chunky as well. Thank you so much, Robin. I can imagine the struggles you dealt with to do with logistics being so remote. I know that a lot of your operation happened throughout spring, summer, fall, and I was wondering how you got meat into the communities of Haida Gwaii, being that it was so far away. Like, was there a barge with a cold storage truck on it, or how did that work?
Yeah, great question, Ben. So we hired, there's a local cutting room on island, which is kind of like the small remote version of an abattoir. And so we contracted those folks, Ruth Whedon and Barry Windecker, fabulous people and business people. And they worked with their local contacts to contract a freezer boat. So it was quite a bit of permitting and figuring it out to make sure that it wasn't going to be a problem for that freezer boat when they had to actually do what they normally do, which is fish. But they were able to convert it to a deer storage operation. And so the way it worked was for every deer that goes into the schools or the elder day programs we supported, there has to be a chain of custody. So you have to know exactly the time the deer was killed, when it was gutted, when it got to 10 degrees, and how it was stored until it's basically wrapped and then delivered. So with the boat being about 2.5 hours from town where we were doing most of the hunting, that was a bit of a challenge. So what happened was when the deer were shot at the bait stations, we would radio in, and then they had a landing craft that would, a landing craft, not like in sci-fi, but like a boat with a ramp. So they would come in and they would take the animals into the chain of custody, and they were gutted right away by the hunters to start the cooling process. So yeah, that was kind of how it worked. And the meat quality was actually surprisingly good because these islands hadn't been hunted much before. There wasn't that much pressure, so the animals were generally small, but they were in surprisingly good shape given it was spring.
We have question coming. A part of people saying thank you and how amazed they are about your talk. They are also asking, was target visibility and shooting precision much greater at biting station versus aerial station?
Yeah, so let me preface this with, so I am a hunter, but I am a really basic hunter. The skill that Norm MacDonald, who was our aerial eradication expert, has is a whole other level. He's got over 10,000 hours doing this kind of work out of helicopters. And so I don't think I've ever seen anyone acquire a target. And by that, I mean, you see an animal, you raise your rifle and you actually have the animal in your scope. I don't think I've ever seen anyone acquire targets faster in my life. My dad's a gun nerd, full disclosure. But yeah, so the target acquisition is extremely different in the aerial setting than it is at bait stations. So at bait stations, you're seeing the animals arrive, you're watching their animal behavior, you're trying to see, are they cocking a head back to see if another animal's arriving? Are they wary? Are they waiting for their fawn to come out? If it's a doe, what are they doing? So you actually have a long time sitting with your heart rate elevated, watching until you actually take down the animals, because you're very, very precisely trying to hit, and this is going to be a little graphic, to hit the brain case, because if you kill them in the head, they drop immediately, and the smell is extremely minimized relative to what most normal hunters do, which is like shoot in the vital organs, like the hearts and the lungs. So the visibility, I'm not sure what to say about visibility. Like the difficulty with the aerial hunting is literally the height that we talked about before and the movement of the animal and making sure you're going to have a clean shot. You need to make sure you have somebody with really great experience.
Wow. We are learning so much today. And I will go to that. There are a couple of other questions. Do you have a feel for how many deer remain on the island? Is the plan to have local hunters keep the deer population down to a level such as 0.1 deer per hectare, or do more cull hunts? Of course, the population is unknown, so one is always guessing.
Yeah, great question, Peter. So we worked with Dr. Carl Schwartz, who was at SFU, he's now retired, to do a Bayesian model as we were removing animals from the islands to try and figure out how many animals we did have left. We also, in addition to the effort data and the removal data, we also put up cameras around the island, both baited cameras and passive cameras, to try and get an occupancy estimate of the numbers. So our best guess at the end of the operations on Ramsey Island, our best guess was an estimate of 8 deer remaining, but it could have been as high as 43 with the confidence intervals. So obviously those deer are breeding and have been breeding since 2017. So I expect, you know, and deer tend to have twins when resources are lush. And so I expect the animal population is back up to, you know, 150 to 200 animals by now. There is a plan to have ongoing deer management on these project islands. And that's what I was alluding to and talking about when I spoke to the symposium, so that we just completed that in November to have this vision for like how we want to deal with things. And now it's up to the folks who are going to be implementing that vision to figure out how they're going to do deer management on some of these islands. The DNA work that we have done with Dr. Mike Russello and Brock Burgess has really shown us that the deer, unless they're on extremely remote islands that are culled regularly to curb the swimming tendency, they're panmictic, which is the genetics term for they swim everywhere and they breed with everybody. So especially the bucks. So the deer management will take that into account as well. So I guess the short answer to that, sorry, that was a very long answer, but the short answer is we don't have a level. To define a level for deer per hectare, you really need to think about what you're trying to maintain, because deer will occasionally, they eat what they like, right? So if you want to bring back cedar, the cedar on Haida Gwaii doesn't have the same phytotoxins or secondary plant chemicals that the cedar on the mainland has. So it's sweet. So it's very tasty. So if you actually want to bring back cedar, you have to keep deer at a lower density than if you wanted to bring back, let's say, salal, which is not a preferred browse. So defining that level per hectare hasn't really been done here because the goal was an eradication. So it's kind of up to that team, of which I'm no longer a part. I'm now working for national office, to figure out what they want to do next. But there is a deer management plan in place.
We have questions keep on coming, and let us know when you need to go, Robin, because I know that soon you will have. They ask if how would you have approached the eradication if there would have been residents on the target island?
Wow, that's a great question, and probably one that Ben could answer far better than I, because quite frankly, Lorna, I didn't. So there were plenty of other concerns to think about. I mean, the social process for people to understand what an eradication is, I think is the same, though probably more in depth with more permanent residents.
And thank you, Robin. We know this was a little bit on the edge because we know that Haida Gwaii, the islands where you focus on your eradication project, had no resident. So a different lens. We know that you have to go, and we don't want to be...
I do want to address the one that Gemma put up, and then I'll take off. But
yes,
she said, it sounds like bait station killing is more ethical. I wouldn't actually frame it that way, Gemma. It's a different situation. So these projects, particularly with Parks Canada, undergo an immense amount of scrutiny and care. And so the Animal Care Committee at Parks Canada reviewed our approaches. And one of the things I alluded to, and the reason I talk about our aerial eradication experts' number of hours is because that's relevant. So like I said, I'm an amateur hunter. If I go out, I want an animal standing still and broadside facing me to make sure it has a good death and is an ethical death. Somebody with 10,000 hours of experience can make sure that the animal has a good and ethical death very, very frequently out of a helicopter above the tree line. So I wouldn't say one is more ethical than the other. I would just say the skill levels are, you need to, well, the expression that's coming to my brain is horses for courses, right? Which is like, you're not going to use a draft horse to run a race. You're not going to, you want to use people who are appropriately trained, who understand it, and you need to have a backup plan because we're human and they make errors. So there's always really strong considerations of ethics around removing these animals, and that applies whatever the method.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat about this, and I'm happy if you pass on questions to the folks who facilitated this. I will support them in answering them if they need me to, but I gotta dash.
Thank you, Robin.
Thanks so much, Robin.